Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about a few queer literary classics. So this was a video that was requested from me back in June for Pride Month, and I just didn't get a chance to make it during June, partly because I was currently reading The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, and I wanted to include that in the video, and then I didn't finish that until like towards the end of the month. So anyway, I thought it would be interesting to talk through a few queer classics today. Obviously there are many queer literary classics I haven't yet read, lots I want to read, but I have picked out 11 today that I think are really interesting, and if you haven't read these, I would recommend them. Some of these are pretty well known, some of these are less well known, some of these are very, very explicitly queer, and some of these are slightly more queer undertones, although like I could have picked a lot more Victorian books with homoerotic undertones, but I picked the ones where I felt that the queerness was quite close to the surface. I think I will probably put the term LGBTQ+ in the title, because I seem to recall that YouTube doesn't always like the word queer in the metadata, but I'll probably use the word queer during the video because I feel like a big umbrella term is quite useful when you're talking about authors or people, characters from the past in a time where like the terms we have now didn't necessarily exist, and it's hard to know how someone would have identified today. So let me get into the books. I have picked out 11 books, and I will start off with The Secret Diaries of Anne Lister. So maybe it feels a bit weird to call a diary a classic, but Virago do publish it under their like modern classics imprint, and it is a work of text from the past. So anyway, Anne Lister, if you don't know, was a really interesting historical figure. She was a female landowner in the early 19th century. She lived from 1791 to 1840, and she wrote lots of diaries, and a good chunk of her diaries she wrote in code. And she wrote in code when she was writing about things she didn't want other people to read. Sometimes when she was writing rude things about her neighbours, sometimes when she was writing about money, and sometimes when she was writing about her romantic and sexual relationships with other women. And The Secret Diaries of Anne Lister are just like an absolutely fascinating read. So I've got them in 2 volumes here. I Know My Own Heart and No Priest But Love, edited by Helena Whitbread, who did a fantastic job editing these diaries. And these are just a fascinating read. I read lots of historical diaries for like historical research for writing, and never have I read diaries that I was like as emotionally invested in as these. I feel like I got to know Anne as a person so much, all the intricacies of her character, and these are a must read if you're interested in social history, for the things you can learn about gender, about sexuality, about class. But Anne Lister was such a snob, and I think actually if you want to understand like how class works in a Jane Austen book, you should read Anne Lister and you'll understand the snobbery of the time. Anyway, Anne Lister's diaries are fascinating, and they give a real insight into how a woman in the early 19th century who was attracted to other women might have understood herself, and the way she writes about her relationships is absolutely fascinating. I would highly recommend Anne Lister's diaries. They are just a wonderful read, and whether or not you're someone who is interested in reading like historical diaries or who reads a lot of non-fiction, like it reads like you're reading a novel. It's that engaging. And then I have picked 3 books from the Victorian period. As I said, I do think there is quite a lot of like homoeroticism in quite a lot of Victorian books, and I did a video ages ago, like 8 years ago, called LGBTQ+ themes in Victorian literature. I'll leave that link down below. It is a very old video, but I talk about lots of other books in there where you can see characters who seem to be queer coded. There is, you know, a very common setup in Victorian literature, where there are 2 friends of the same gender who are very, very like close friends, who seem to have quite like a romantic friendship, and then one of them will fall in love with the other one's sibling who is of a different gender. Like that's a very common little setup in Victorian literature, and it nearly always feels like they have just shifted their romantic interest from one sibling to the other for like propriety's sake, and it's really interesting. There's also a wonderful book by Holly Furneaux called Queer Dickens, who talks about all the sort of queer stuff you can find in Dickens. It's great. But anyway, I'm not going to talk too much about Victorian literature today because I didn't want this video to be dominated by Victorian literature, but I did pick out 3 Victorian books that I think are really quite gay. So one is Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a vampire novella from 1872 about a young woman called Laura who is living with her father when a young woman called Carmilla turns up at their house. They end up having her to stay, and there is something mysterious about Carmilla, and Laura finds herself increasingly drawn to Carmilla in lots of different ways. I love Carmilla. I think it's fascinating, and it's a really interesting like vampire novel. You know, I think a lot of people think of Dracula as like the quintessential Victorian vampire story, but I think Carmilla is much more interesting and much better myself, and the clear attraction between Laura and Carmilla is a really interesting part of the novella, so I thought I would include Carmilla in this video. Then next I want to talk about Jill by Amy Dilwyn. This is a novel from 1884, and Jill is a really interesting character who subverts all ideas of what a Victorian woman should be. She is much more interested in money than she is in love. She lies and cheats and does all the things that are kind of considered improper, and she is also much more interested in women than she is in men. Jill, as a young woman, runs away from home because she doesn't want to live there anymore. She's really bored, so she goes and runs away and becomes a servant and ends up working for a woman called Kitty, who she is very much in love with. It's not like below the surface, like Jill is in love with Kitty. I don't see how you could read this book in any other way. Kitty is in love with a man. This is more of a unrequited love story, but the way Jill feels about Kitty is very clear. We know that Amy Dilwyn, the author, had feelings for other women. She kind of writes about this in her diaries. There was a woman called Olive, I think, who she was in love with, and we think it was probably unrequited, but we don't really know enough. Amy Dilwyn's own life obviously influenced her books, and actually in one of her other novels that I've read, A Burglary, there is another kind of interesting look at attraction between women, in which there's a young woman who has a clearly romantic crush on another woman, and then later has feelings for a man. And this is like very explicitly said, but I thought I would talk about Jill mainly in this book because I feel like that's more relevant than A Burglary. But anyway, Amy Dilwyn is a fascinating writer to look at if you're interested in queer Victorian fiction. She was also a very interesting person who led an unconventional life and enjoyed breaking gender boundaries. So I would highly recommend Amy Dilwyn, very underrated, wonderful Victorian writer. Finally, for the Victorians, I also wanted to mention The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is obviously quite well known for its homoeroticism. This is a book about Dorian Gray, who is a young, beautiful man who wants to stay beautiful forever and finds a complicated way to do that. There is a character called Basil, who is the artist who paints the picture of Dorian Gray, and Basil is definitely in love with Dorian, and there's lots of other interesting things in this book about male relationships, and obviously it's quite well known that Oscar Wilde himself had relationships with men, and the sort of trial of Oscar Wilde was a very important like moment within queer history in the late Victorian period. And The Picture of Dorian Gray is just a wonderful, incredible, atmospheric book. I think it's so good. Okay, we're moving into the 20th century. I wanted to mention Maurice by E.M. Forster. So this book was written in the 1910s, though it wasn't actually published until the 1970s after E.M. Forster's death. E.M. Forster himself was a gay man, and the books that were published during his lifetime don't touch on gay relationships, although they do often touch on relationships that are unexpected. Like, people often love the people that you wouldn't narratively expect them to love, which I think is actually quite interesting. Anyway, that's a side note. Maurice was a book that he wrote about a gay man and his relationship with chiefly two other men, but he didn't want it published during his lifetime because he didn't think that it would be well received. Maurice is a book about a young man, Maurice, growing up, coming to understand that he is attracted to other men, about his loneliness, and also about him meeting men who he falls in love with. And I just think this book is such a wonderful character study, such a beautiful, poignant love story, such a wonderful book about identity and belonging, and trying to find someone to spend your life with, and I think it is just wonderful, so I really, really recommend it. And I would also especially recommend this Penguin edition, because it has in it, after Maurice itself, it has what's called the terminal note, which E.M. Forster wrote in 1960 about the novel, which I think is hugely worth a read, though quite upsetting in some ways, because E.M. Forster didn't feel that much more hopeful about gay rights in 1960 than he had done in the 1910s. But I do think it is really important to read that note as well. And yeah, I just highly recommend Maurice. I think it is incredible. Then also from the 1910s, here is Despised and Rejected by Rose Alatini, a wonderful novel from 1918 that was banned when it was published, partly because of the discussion of queer relationships, but also because of the book's pacifist message and its anti-World War I message. This book is about two people who kind of meet and form a connection. One of them is a gay man and one of them is probably a bisexual woman, I guess is probably how we define her looking back from a modern perspective. And we basically look at these two people and their lives, how they meet and how knowing each other helps them understand each other more. And we look at their friendship. And as I said, this book is also about the First World War and about conscientious objectors and about the treatment of conscientious objectors during the war. And it's just incredible. I think about this book all the time and I really, really recommend it. You know, I feel like some of the books I'm talking about in this video, you know, books like Maurice and The Well of Loneliness, which I'm going to talk about next, are really famous books that are well-known queer classics, but Despised and Rejected is not, and it should be. Maurice was written in the 1910s, but it wasn't published until a lot later, but this was published in 1918. Yes, it was banned immediately, but for a book that was published in 1918, to have the very, like, overt discussions it has about sexuality was really, really bold and brave, and really significant. And it's such a powerful novel that I just heartily recommend to everyone. So do go out and get Despised and Rejected. I'm so glad that Persephone Books have brought it back into print. I think it's really, really worth a read. Next, I want to talk about The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, which is a Bildungsroman from 1928, following the life of Stephen Gordon as she grows up in a English country house and begins to realise that she is attracted to other women. This book is about Stephen's relationships with her family and with the women she falls in love with. It's about her career as a writer. It's about her time as an ambulance driver during the First World War. It's about her experience as someone who isn't accepted by the world around her, and it is a truly incredible novel. I have just made a full review of it. I read this back in June and just was absolutely blown away by it. Like, genuinely one of my favourite books I've ever read. My favourite book on this list, and I love the books on this list a lot. I love The Well of Loneliness. I'm sure I will reread it a lot of times, and I think it is incredible. It has a reputation for being a very sad book, but I think it is worth knowing that it is not wallowing miserable sad. It is angry sad. This book is furious and is a cry for justice and for acceptance in a really incredible way, and I just really, really recommend it a lot. Next, I want to mention a novella by George Moore called Albert Nobbs. George Moore is a really interesting writer spanning the late 19th and early 20th century, who was obviously quite interested in sort of pushing the boundaries of what it was acceptable to write about. I think in that old video, LGBTQ plus themes in Victorian literature, I talked about his novel Drama in Muslin, in which there is a woman who is definitely in love with another woman. And in Albert Nobbs, we encounter the character of Albert Nobbs, who, depending on your interpretation of the novella as a modern reader, is either a trans man or a lesbian woman living as a man in order to earn more money, because this was a point in time when men earned a lot more money than women. I would probably incline towards the former reading, but obviously George Moore wrote this novella at a time before we understand things in the same way that we do today. I think it's interesting that within the novella, whenever Albert Nobbs is wearing men's clothes, the pronouns he are used, and whenever Albert Nobbs is not wearing men's clothes, the pronouns she are used. And I think it's a really fascinating book in terms of gender and pushing gender boundaries, considering it's from the 1920s. The book is about Albert Nobbs' life and experiences, and about what happens when he falls in love with a woman and wants to get married, and is aware that that may be complicated for him, and it's just really good. Sticking with the 1920s but moving over to Japan, I feel like it's been a very British list so far, just because that's what I have read the most in, but I wanted to quickly mention Quicksand by Junichiro Tanizaki from between 1928 and 1930. This edition I have is translated from the Japanese by Howard Hibbett, and this is a very interesting novel about a married woman who finds herself increasingly drawn to another woman. I really love Tanizaki. I think he's a wonderful Japanese classic writer who just wrote a lot of very interesting and very different books. It's been a while since I read Quicksand, but it's really fascinating and tense and definitely worth a read. The next book I want to mention is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is a novel from 1956. We're following a character called David who is living in Paris. He's in a relationship with a woman. I think they're engaged, but I can't quite remember precisely. But she has gone away for a time, and in her absence, David falls in love with a man called Giovanni, and we follow the complex fallout of their relationship. And this is just amazing. I must read more James Baldwin because I read this a couple of years ago and I just was blown away by it, and especially blown away by the writing. And I'm not usually like a reader who is there for the writing. I'm usually there for the plot and the characters and the themes, but the writing in Giovanni's Room is so beautiful that I just like really remember the writing so much. I thought it was so incredibly written and so powerful. I mean, it's such a tiny book as well. Like, it will take you all of a few hours to read, and it's just fantastic. So I would really, really highly recommend Giovanni's Room. Then the final book I wanted to mention is The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin, a really interesting science fiction novel from 1969 that does interesting things with gender and sexuality. So in The Left Hand of Darkness, we're following a character, a man who travels to an alien planet, and this is a planet that doesn't have a concept of gender. People are all one gender, and the book is about a lot of things. It's a really fascinating science fiction novel, one I want to reread actually, because again, it has been quite a long time since I read this one. But the book looks really interestingly at gender and sexuality and at how we understand gender, and at how different societies might understand gender completely differently, and it's really, really worth a read, and it's a book that I still think about a lot considering how long it has been since I read it. So there we go, those are a few really wonderful LGBTQ plus classics that I would really highly recommend. Do let me know down in the comments if you have any more recommendations for queer classics. I'm really interested in queer history and queer literary history, so I'm always interested to read more on this topic. So yeah, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.